Yeah. Oh, just to mention too, if at any time you need to take a pause for whatever reason, just let me know. I can always edit it out later.
Okay.
Well, I'm here with Jeremy Narby. Jeremy, thanks so much for joining me on the podcast. I really appreciate it.
It's a pleasure, Brian.
I've been following your work for many years now. I remember reading Cosmic Serpent when it came out, and I think it blew a lot of people's minds. But I love the ideas and concepts that you put forward in that book, and it's been really fun to follow your work over the years.
Thanks.
And yeah, you've got this new book, and I'm actually really happy that you put it out. So it's called Plant Teachers, Ayahuasca, Tobacco, and the Pursuit of Knowledge. And I one of the things I appreciate about it is that it's a little book. Um, I don't know who decided that all books had to be 250 pages or more in order to be taken seriously, but I appreciate a small, concise, and clearly written book. And I think this fills a niche actually, in that it provides. I could see it as being used as a kind of reference for ayahuasca and tobacco because you cover both indigenous views of these plant medicines and the scientific views. And it feels quite comprehensive to me. So, off the bat, I just want to say thanks for writing the book.
Okay. Well, I can say two things about that. The first is that I had the idea of doing this short kind of capsule-like book with what you need to know about the two plants. And then when I ran it by the different publishers or potential publishers, they all said it's so short, it's too short. How can we beef it up? I mean, they're looking to sell paper, and nobody's I'm not blaming, but I'm just saying that the format of the publishing industry, it's hard to get a publisher behind a kind of a short book like that. So I was happy to find the rare bird with New World Library. Then the other thing is that I sent it to a kind of actually he was the original publisher of the Cosmic Serpent in French in 1995, Henry Weizenbach in Geneva. He's now retired and living up in the mountains, so he's kind of like a wise old man. And he read it, and then he said, "Oh, it's a vade mecum." I said, "What?" Um, in Latin, it means take it with me. It's going to come with me, or a take with. It's, in other words, a small book you can take with you, and you're going to return to it for references regularly. And it turns out that in Latin they already had a kind of a name for this, a sort of a small, concise book that tells you what you need to know about a given subject. So
Yeah.
yep, it's a vade mecum.
Vademecum, yeah, also known as a pocketbook or kind of
Yeah,
chapbook.
yeah. But
Yeah,
not just that you can put it in your pocket, but that you're probably, if you really are interested in the two plants, you're probably going to want to return to it regularly because it has information on all kinds of different aspects of the plant. And, so it's a quick source to reference that way.
yeah. No, certainly. And you really cover all the bases there, and it clarifies a lot of what I think are misconceptions about these two plants. And I want to get there, but kind of initially, what inspired you to write this book at this time? I mean, you've written about ayahuasca before, but
Mhm.
why tobacco, and why talk about these two plants together?
Well, um, as somebody who I've been working for the last 31 years as a fundraiser for indigenous Amazonian initiatives like land titling or bilingual education programs or fish farms or legal training or all kinds of different aspects of the lives of indigenous Amazonian people so that they and their rainforest can survive. Um, so it always has been about when I write books or give talks. making their point of view understandable or heard or like that. And it's true that there's a lot of people talking about ayahuasca. There's a lot of people talking about Amazonian shamanism. And the Amazonian point of view on that particular question, on like the ayahuasca shamanism, is that ayahuasca and tobacco go together. They're inseparable. They are both master plants, teacher plants, and they're both very powerful. They're both medicinal. And there's actually a drawing of the cosmovision of the Shipibo people where you see their view of the world and the cosmos. And instead of north, east, west, south, which are like these two arrows that cross over, you have tobacco, ayahuasca, jaguar, anaconda.
Hmm.
And so the two plants are tobacco and ayahuasca, and the two animals are jaguar and anaconda. And those are the four cardinal points of the Shipibo cosmovision, according to this one particular representation of it. It goes to show how central and fundamental ayahuasca and tobacco are. Now, in the Western world or Northern world or industrial world, whatever you want to call it, the friends of ayahuasca are often soft peddling the tobacco part. Tobacco has bad press. Tobacco is like a controversial plant, and people confuse it with cigarettes and the harm that industrial cigarettes do. And so I thought that the idea of wanting to talk about tobacco, I can tell you, if you liked The Cosmic Serpent, you may have noticed that tobacco is mentioned as often in The Cosmic Serpent as ayahuasca is. And when I wrote that book initially, I did not think that I had written an ayahuasca book. I thought I'd written a book about the shamanism of indigenous Amazonian people. It also discussed ayahuasca, but it discussed tobacco just as much. That's the whole thing, is that Westerners have had relatively and actually a surprisingly easy time getting into ayahuasca. Even that was a surprise to me, because in 1995, if you told me that it would become a fad for Western people to drink this powerful and vomitive hallucinogenic plant mixture, I would have said, probably not. They like kind of pills that don't taste of anything. But that was, in fact, turned out to be completely wrong. Ayahuasca has become fashionable almost. And at the same time, tobacco continues to be viewed as this bad thing that you want to avoid, and that is part of the tobacco industry or something like that. So the idea of right at the heart of indigenous Amazonian knowledge, you have these two plants. Tobacco is actually the #1 shamanic plant. I mean, if we have to do a ranking, tobacco is ahead of ayahuasca in terms of how widely it's used and how commonly it's used. And it's always used with ayahuasca, whereas ayahuasca is not always used with tobacco. In other words, if you use tobacco, you can use it on your own. But if you're using ayahuasca, almost invariably the practitioners will use tobacco. And so the idea of writing about tobacco in terms of making the indigenous Amazonian point of view understandable to an international audience, that was the first kind of experimental idea. And I thought, what better way to do that than to go and speak with an Amazonian expert who knows the subject. And after interviewing Rafael Chanchari, who was a Shawi elder that I've known for 20 years, actually, I thought his answers were so good that it was a chapter on its own. And it really did encapsulate the indigenous view on the subject. And then when I went and checked his answers about what he said tobacco could do, what he said it could heal, and so on, and looked into recent science about it. And actually, the last time I looked into the science of tobacco was when I was writing The Cosmic Serpent, 1994, 1995. So 25 years later. I went back into it, and I was surprised to find how much contemporary science corresponds to what indigenous Amazonian experts say about the plant. Um, and so at that point, I thought, well, this is interesting. After one chapter where you get the indigenous view on the plant, you get another chapter where you get the scientific view of the plant, and you read both, and you get a sort of a broad range of knowledge about the plant where you're not told what to think. You can actually choose what you think is the most pertinent way of looking at it. In fact, these are two different angles. I think that they're complementary angles, but so some people can say, oh, I only subscribe to the indigenous view, and all that talk about scientific molecules makes my eyes glaze over. Well, that's okay. Or vice versa. I mean, some sort of hard-boiled rationalist might not like the indigenous chapters, but will appreciate the clarity of the molecular chapters. So there is a sort of almost a complete range of ways of looking at the plant. And then I thought, well, this is interesting. Instead of making it like, I don't know, a short article or something, we could actually repeat the procedure with ayahuasca, see what the same expert who knows tobacco, who knows ayahuasca, who works with them as a healer. So let's do it again. And I interviewed him on ayahuasca, including on difficult questions. And then I looked into the recent science of ayahuasca. And once again, actually, the science of ayahuasca since the year 2000 has exploded. There was no science, really, of ayahuasca in 1995, or very little. And so there's been enormous progress of the scientific understanding of ayahuasca. And at the same time, it's such a young science that it also has limits. It also has things that it tends to reduce ayahuasca to DMT, for example.
Yeah.
Whereas that is almost like an obvious mistake if you take ayahuasca seriously, simply because there are many forms of ayahuasca that do not contain DMT and
Yeah.
that are active. I mean, that's easy enough.
Yeah.
But
I want to
anyway,
get to that.
the idea I'll just finish is that repeating the juxtaposition, so you get the indigenous view of ayahuasca, then the synthesis of the current scientific understanding, where you see the limits of science, and then there you have it. It's that's the vade mecum. That's what you can take with you in your pocket. It's this is what's known more or less, and in summary, about the plant at the moment, from two different angles, two different systems of knowledge, indigenous and scientific. And then there it is. It's available to you, and then you can figure it out.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate that. And the book feels very much like a dialogue between the North and the South, and between you and your friend Rafael, between science and the Amazonian or indigenous perspective. And I think that's really important to have that dialogue. There's a lot that those points of view can learn from each other, I think. And I think that was something that I really liked about Cosmic Serpent, is because it felt like that's kind of what you had done. And in doing that, create a kind of new mythology about ayahuasca, that the serpent in all of the cosmology and the imagery around Amazonian shamanism could actually be a representation of the DNA strand. And I think that's really what blew people's minds. It was one of those, like, from without to within, from the macro to the micro, and just wow. I don't know if anyone had put those two things together before. So this book is in that kind of theme, but also you don't do that bringing together, and you kind of leave the dialogues as they are, and like you said, let the reader make their own conclusions or develop their own mythology.
Well, the Cosmic Serpent so was published in French 26 years ago, and in English 23 years ago. It was meant as like an activist's book to kind of make people think. So, what if these two forms? And so there was a kind of a deliberate fireworks aspect to it. Here, and so there's a time for that, and I'm really happy with that book and what it did and so forth. But I also think there's a time for this particular small book focused on two plants is more like an exercise book to the Cosmic Serpent. In other words, we don't even need to think about any kind of complicated metaphysics or molecules or mythological representations or anything. Let's just take these two plants that are both Amazonian, both somewhat controversial. Tobacco is used by 1 billion or more people every day. Ayahuasca is probably used by 1,000 times less people, but still, it gets a lot of press. And as in the Cosmic Serpent, where I was going back and forth all the time between indigenous knowledge and science and looking at how they corresponded and said similar things, but from a different angle. Here is, well, we're just talking about two plants, two psychoactive plants. And so here's the indigenous angle, here's the scientific angle. And this time, the reader gets to go back and forth and to figure out where he or she wants to stand. And so it's not even metaphysics. It really is just thinking about two plants and thinking about what is the angle from which you want to think about the plant, or are you flexible enough to hold both of those angles in your mind at the same time and then put it together or make them kind of overlap in your mind? Does that give you a sort of a deeper understanding or a thicker understanding of it? Well, that's up to the reader to see. And so it's not all that different from the Cosmic Serpent in that it really does to propose not only two systems of knowledge, but looking at how one can go back and forth between the two. So it's like an exercise book as well.
Yeah. And I think, like ayahuasca, you could read about it all you want, but until you've experienced tobacco in that context where it's used as a medicine and it's usually a different strain of tobacco from what's available in the North and commercial tobacco products, until you've had that experience, you really have no idea what tobacco is. And you give people a little bit of a sense of that. And I wonder if you could just share that story about your first encounter with tobacco as a medicine.
Yeah. Well, I'd start by saying that tobacco never was my plant. In other words, I tried smoking cigarettes when I was an adolescent a couple of times, but it was just I didn't like the taste. The effect didn't call me. Actually, one time, just for fun, I inhaled on a cigar a few times, and it just made me nauseous. So I thought that I didn't like tobacco at all. And then, as a young anthropologist, in the middle of the 1980s, I ended up doing my field work with Ashaninka people, right in the middle of the Peruvian Amazon. Their word for doctor or shaman is sheri piari. Sheri means tobacco. Piari is doctor, the tobacco doctor. You have a problem, you go and see the tobacco doctor. Invariably a man. He will take his tobacco paste and then do a diagnosis, think about things. And tobacco is also applied as a remedy, but that's another question. So one day I was with the 45-year-old Shaninka, who was my main consultant, and he went up to visit his shaman teacher, tabaquero teacher. And this was an old Ashaninka. He was so old he didn't even know his own age because he was born before the Ashaninka learned about numbers. So he was probably about at least 80 years old in 1985. And um, he started playing around with me a little bit. So he was just sitting there eating his tobacco paste, and I was a 25-year-old white boy, and he kept asking me in Ashaninka whether I was his father-in-law, and I thought this guy, and he asked me like 20 times in a row, so it was kind of hypnotic and strange. But I thought, I'm not going to let this guy get to me, so I'm just going to say yes every time. And he kept on laughing. My Ashaninka friend told me later that night that what that question meant was, can I sleep with your daughters? So the joke was on me
Yeah,
from the
you thought you were humoring him.
but so anyway, after about 20 times, I decided to sort of kind of interrupt his game, and I asked him, could I try some of your tobacco paste? He said sure, and handed me this gourd with a stick in it. And so just to show that I wasn't afraid of anything, I took a dollop of this stuff and put it in between my lips, and then I sat to the side and allowed the gentleman to move on with their business. And after about 10 minutes, I started feeling like that my whiskers were growing, my teeth were getting long and sharp, my mouth tasted of blood. Um, I started eyeing the chickens that were clucking around, and decided not to attack them. I started feeling like a feline, like I was as if I was turning into a big jungle cat. Uh, it felt warm, aggressive, and wise, all sort of bundled into one. I mean, I was even thinking, oh, well, the tobacco paste is strong when the anthropologist starts attacking the chickens.
Mhm.
So, and at the same time, so I was kind of thinking fast, laughing at myself at the same time. It was all going on. And it was a very powerful body-based experience of having the impression of being a big, powerful cat.
Mhm.
Um, and at the time, I didn't even think things like that were possible. Um, but it was a very strong impression, and it actually was something that I'm still able to convoke it uh, 36 years later, if I want to. Um,
Yeah.
I I know what it might feel like to be a powerful feline, and I can and because that memory is in the body more than in the brain. um, I can kind of convoke it and use it when I need to, which is not that often these days. But early on in my career, when I get up to talk in front of big audiences and stuff, to avoid being nervous and so forth, I just sort of channel a bit of that energy, and
Yeah.
it was actually pretty useful. But it was also something that I never really talked about because it was a little bit too far out there.
Yeah.
So it was more something that I used than talked about. But I
Yeah.
put it in the first chapter of, in the introduction of this new book, just because, well, the book was about tobacco, and I think it's important also to situate oneself, and that was really the one and only major tobacco experience that I had. I was not that interested in repeating it. So even though it was a powerful experience and it's turned out to be very useful over the years, it was never something where I thought, "Oh, I got to get some more of that shamanic tobacco paste and turn into a jaguar more often."
Mhm. Well,
It,
you've
it
got that experience. You can draw on that and invoke the big cat energy when you need it, right?
right? Why repeat?
Yeah. Have you not spent time at Mayantiyaku with Juan Flores?
I've spent a whole bunch of time at my Antiyaku with Juan Flores.
Okay, I thought so. Yeah, I went and visited him. And before we could drink any ayahuasca, he had us do a tobacco ceremony or tobacco purge.
Mhm.
So did you not encounter it with him in that context?
Yeah, I once did a tobacco purge with Juan Flores in Mayantuyacu, and that was the I think yeah the only time that I did it. Uh-huh.
Hmm. How would that experience compare to taking the paste? Is there any similarity?
No, I think it's a pretty different experience, and actually, the tobacco purge is something that needs looking into. In
Hmm.
that it's a fairly modern innovation, I think, and I think this is what would need to be researched. There's not much evidence of traditional, whatever that word means, but let's just say historical tobacco purge. It's more something that has come with this whole new world of people going to the Peruvian Amazon to try ayahuasca. So it's like a more of a modern invention, which doesn't mean that it's a bad thing in any way. But it's not something that the Ashaninka that I was living with were practicing. Like this old guy who was born in the early 20th century. I mean, he was never doing tobacco purges, and he was always eating his tobacco paste, and that was it. But there's all kinds of ways of using tobacco, but um, a tobacco purge is more about cleaning the body than it is about a shaman using a paste for a precise effect. So there are shamans who drink tobacco, but as Raphael Chanchari says in the book, that has more to do with sorcery.
Hmm.
There are shamans who smoke tobacco, and that often has to do with healing and you blowing smoke on people and so on. And then there are the practitioners of tobacco paste, and Ashaninka are well known for being tobacco paste practitioners. Not all indigenous people in the Peruvian Amazon produce tobacco paste, but clearly it's something that has hundreds of years of use, and it's an old shamanic tool in the Western Amazon.
Hmm. Yeah, it's interesting because having that tobacco purge with Juan Flores was a certain kind of experience, and it did feel like it was kind of a physical preparation for drinking the ayahuasca, like just clearing things out. But then I've had another experience with an ayahuasquero who apprenticed with a guy in Iquitos, a mestizo guy. And it was very different. We drank some tobacco water, but it had other ingredients in it. Tasted like it had tons of jungle garlic in it, um, and the tabacero would pour it up your nose when you thought you had drank enough. It was like
Uh,
just trying to get as much into you as possible and then going through a purge. But in that case, it was very psychotropic. There was a lot of kind of emotional release accompanying the physical purge. So it was a very different experience. And there was Ikaros sung over us. And
did you like it?
did I like it? No, it was one of the most uncomfortable
All right.
experiences of my life. But there was a healing, a really deep healing
Mhm.
that occurred because of that. Um, but yeah, it was quite a different thing than that tobacco purge that I did at Mayantiyaku. So that's one of the things that struck me about going down there is this whole world of tobacco opening up to me. I mean, there's so many ways that people prepare it down there and get it in the human body. And you cover a lot of those in the book, which I was really happy to see. Something like hape, I think about because it's become quite popular in neo-shamanic circles,
Mhm.
but I haven't been able to find any reliable information on it. Could you talk a little bit about what you found about hape, which is, for people who don't know, it's a powdered form of tobacco that is blown up the nose.
Well, some people swear by it. I actually had some Kashinawa people from Brazil, Huni Queen people. blow some up my nose. I was being polite at that point. And it really knocked me out for 3-4 hours, and then my sinuses were suffering for the next 3 weeks. I mean, it was a very intense experience, but I mean, it was a big dose blown up the nostrils, and yikes. But I mean, some folks like that. There are people who take their rapé, and so it's this Amazonian snuff, really. And it hasn't been studied that much. There's only one kind of molecular study of what's in rapé, and rapé is often mixed with other plants just for taste. There are industrial rapés that are sold in Brazil, for example. Actually, the single study that exists compared 10 industrial Brazilian rapés to 2 rapés that were handmade by indigenous Amazonian people. And the industrial kind had like 15 times more nitrosamines. Nitrosamines are these carcinogenic molecules that appear in fermented tobacco. The bacteria eat the nitrogen in the tobacco, and depending on how it's been dried, if it's been fermented, then you get a lot of this nitrosamine, which is a byproduct of their activity in there. So it's not initially in the tobacco. It really does depend on how it's treated. And so these industrial rapés are fermented to give a kind of a smoky taste, but they're filled with these carcinogenic substances. Whereas the indigenous rapés did not have these. They had actually very surprisingly low levels of nitrosamines. And because they're fire dried, they're not sort of slow dried and fermented. But they did have some hydrocarbons in there from the fire drying. So that's another thing that needs saying about any form of tobacco. There is no safe tobacco. It's like, unsafe at any speed, kind of. But you can limit its dangers. I mean, you want to avoid any kind of tobacco that is rich in nitrosamines, and the longer your tobacco product sits on a shelf at temperature on a shelf in a store at ambient temperature, the more of this carcinogenic substance is going to have. It's like, I think the amount doubles over 6 months. So it depends on how the tobacco has been dried. It depends on how you store it. And it really is something that if you have tobacco that is rich in this, it gives cancer to your nose, to your mouth, to your esophagus. And it's not the nicotine, it's not the plant itself. It is this, I'm not saying that, but that there are no, like when you smoke, there are other byproducts and they too can give you cancer. But it's pretty obvious that it is not nicotine that is responsible for cancer. And the nitrosamines are at the top of the list of the substances that are associated with tobacco products that do give cancer. Anyway, I'm getting slightly away from the rapés, but it's just to say that there's not much known scientifically about them. They can contain all kinds of different other plants, ginger and clove, and just for taste. And then depending on how they've been dried and treated, what you are then putting up your nose can contain many different substances. And it's powerful. It's rich in nicotine. I think people have the idea that if they're not smoking, it must be better. Yeah. I think it depends. If you're smoking a strong shamanic Nicotiana rustica and you're doing it occasionally, it may well be less harmful to your overall health than if you're sniffing industrially produced râpé that is rich in nitrosamines. So it's not necessarily true that sniffing râpé is better for you, as it were. It still is tobacco. It still is powerful, and you got to be careful as to what it actually contains.
Yeah. Well, I really appreciate that information because I've been using Hape for years, and I was under the impression that it was a safer alternative to regular smoking, and I had no idea about these byproducts from different drying methods. So it's really important information.
I think
Most
that
of
an
yeah.
easy thing to do is if you know your râpé producer, you can ask them what are the other plants that are in there, and how is it dried? Is it slow dried and fermented, or is it fire dried? And
Hmm.
even if it is fire dried, there is I don't know, yeah, preoccupying levels of hydrocarbons in there. It's not, it never is entirely pure or clear. It's interesting when you look. I mean, the Swedes, oddly enough, the Swedish people have come up with what seems like the least harmful way of consuming tobacco. So they pay a lot of attention to not putting too much nitrogen in the soil. And so that these are not nitrogen-rich plants. That really limits the level of the nitrosamines. The less nitrogen there is, the less the bacteria can turn it into nitrosamines. And then they pasteurize it. Once they've harvested it, they pasteurize it and they get rid as much as possible of any bacteria. And then they air dry it fairly quickly and turn it into a powder, which is called snus. And at this point, snus has extremely low levels of nitrosamine. Um, and then what you do is it's like a tobacco that you kind of that you suck on, so it's in the mouth. Um, However, as I was saying, unsafe at any speed. So it's true, they don't have mouth cancer, they don't have esophagus cancer, they certainly don't have lung cancer, they don't have many of the problems of the serious health problems associated with tobacco. But they do have, so regular Swedish snus users do have an increased level of diabetes, because that's what nicotine does do, is it makes the sugar in the blood stay in the blood longer, because it makes it more difficult for the sugar to go into the cells. It actually messes inside cells with their capacity to absorb sugar from the blood. So the blood accumulates, so the sugar accumulates in the blood. So, and also nicotine, even though it doesn't cause cancer, besides causing diabetes or increasing the risk of diabetes, it is also bad for fetus and newly born babies. So even though Swedish snus seems more or less riskless, it's not for pregnant mothers either. So even this pasteurized, well thought out, Swedish, almost riskless tobacco product seems pretty good. It's still not entirely safe and good for the human health.
Yeah. Well, this is very much looking at tobacco from that scientific reductionist point of view.
Uh,
And so a purist might say, well, okay, you've refined this tobacco product, but in doing so, you've lost actually the spirit of tobacco, which makes it a teacher and a healer. And this is kind of like getting to that point in your book about these plants having like two sides to them or two spirits.
Well, that would actually be a very interesting research question. It would be to take, because Swedish snus, one of the reasons why, for example, it's banned in the European Union outside of Sweden and Norway, is that it is rich in easily available nicotine. In other words, when you put this pouch of snus in your mouth, you really do get a full delivery of nicotine. It's not one of these like a cigarette, which is a relatively light delivery of nicotine, because they want you to light up another one 20 minutes later. They don't want you to get the full shamanic hit. But snus is strong. So it's strong and it's relatively clean. It would be interesting to take some good
Yeah.
Swedish snus, keep it nice and refrigerated, because you want to keep those nitrosamines way down close to zero, and then give it to indigenous rapé experts. Actually, the only scientific study of the indigenous rapé that I was talking about before found nitrosamine levels that were comparable to Swedish snus. So
Very
these
low.
extremely low, like close to zero. So by fire drying pure tobacco in the rainforest with homemade methods, they're getting close to advanced Swedish industrial procedure in terms of limiting the nitrosamines and making a strong tobacco product. And so it would be great to get an Amazonian jury and to get them to give us a 1 out of 10 estimate on the shamanic worth of Swedish snus.
I love that. I might actually I
Let's
might lead the charge on that. I know a Sherry Piatti that I could bring some too, actually. Well, that's good to hear, actually, that the kind of traditionally produced hape or rape in Spanish is at those levels of the very refined Swedish product, because
well,
that's where I get
it,
my supply, actually.
at least the two ones that were tested in the only
Right.
existing study. So I mean, that's another thing, is that really here we are talking, but this has been understudied for the moment, and it certainly deserves more attention
Sure.
before we can have any kind of certitude.
But the kind of main bullet points, if you are using hape, I would say look for the fire dried version. Um, be
Uh,
careful about what additives are in it.
Yeah, I think that the less sort of taste enhancing things that they put in there, the better in terms of putting it up your nose.
And then once you've got your hape, keep it refrigerated.
That makes sense too.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I think any tobacco product by this logic, if it's possible, should be refrigerated. You know,
Mm.
if you have a fridge and if you work with tobacco in any form, I'd keep it in the fridge, precisely because there will always be some bacteria in there, and the more time you give them at room temperature, the more nitrosamines are going to produce, and the less healthy your tobacco is going to become.
Yeah. Well, it's amazing. I mean, I've been working with tobacco for years, and no one ever said, "Hey, keep your hape, keep your tobacco, keep your mapacho, keep it in the fridge."
So
So this is,
you see, doing your scientific homework sometimes pays off.
oh, for sure. Um, but there is that aspect in the book that you talk about where these plants are traditionally seen as having two sides to them, so that ayahuasca isn't always good, tobacco isn't always a good teacher, and all of that, right? Can you speak a little bit about that?
Well, my co-author Rafael Chanchari is the fellow who can really talk about that. In other words, um, his way of knowing these plants is to consider them as persons, as powerful entities, as if they had a personality. Um, and that, yes, according to him, all of these teacher plants, all of these plants that are powerful, we would call them psychoactive, um, and sources of these experiences that can lead to knowledge, that they all have like two faces or a double edge, that it's like any form of power and knowledge, really. It can be used one way or the other. Um, I think that's also what it comes down to. So that when you have a plant as powerful as tobacco or a plant mixture as powerful as ayahuasca, it can open you up to many different perspectives. And some of these can be negative. Some of these can be about using that power to abuse people. And so the interface between the human and the plant can empower the person, and then the person, if they're not, uh, if they don't have a sort of an appropriate education before that, it can seriously mislead them. And there's all kinds of examples, even in the indigenous world, of people who, well, it's called sorcery, really. People who use the power and knowledge that these plants give them for their own benefit and to the disadvantage of other people. They use that to, and you know, there's all kinds of examples of ayahuasqueros who enchant their female clients to abuse them. In other words, the this actually comes up in traditional shamanism quite a bit, that people who are learning are first confronted by the temptation to abuse their newly acquired power long before they figure out how they can use it to do good in the world. And if you're going to go down the healing path, you first have to sort of turn away from the dark path, which presents itself first and quite easily. So, and this is something that almost all shamanic practitioners are warned about. So whether it's that these plants themselves have two faces, or whether it's because they impact on the human brain, mind, body, and that we ourselves have two faces, and that even though even the best of us are tempted to abuse the power and the knowledge we have, and to use it only for our own benefit and against other people. You know, what the shamanic practitioners say is that if you see a healing shaman, you say, "Oh, he's on the white path. He's not on the black path. He's on the white path. He's formidable. He heals people all the time." Well, it may well be true, but those are the people that you want to keep your eye on, because those are the people who are going to be most tempted to abuse their power. The more power you have, the more you're going to be tempted to abuse it. So actually, no one is ever entirely not only above suspicion, but nobody is ever entirely white in this game.
Yeah.
You know, so that I think that in the human being, you, me, anybody, we have this two-sided possibility, and that you have to acknowledge it and deal with it. And you know, I try to keep on a straight and narrow, and I try to avoid that stuff. But I'm sure there are people who tell you that I'm a disagreeable idiot. I mean, you know, there it is. But you know, this I think needs saying about plants like tobacco and ayahuasca. If you are an ambitious, egomaniac, self-centered fellow, it's only probably going to make you worse. It's going to exacerbate that. In other words, these power plants, if you have somebody who's power hungry and what they want is to accumulate personal power, and they start working with these plants, they're probably not going to get any better. They're probably going to get worse.
Yeah, this idea that if you gave Donald Trump ayahuasca, that he would all of a sudden be, rehabilitated is a fantasy. But I think, you know, like I really appreciated that quote that you included from Luis Eduardo Luna, where he said the most dangerous aspect of ayahuasca isn't the kind of hell trips you can go through or whatever, but it's the ego inflation that can happen.
Mm.
Even to think, you know, that, you know, an egomaniac going into it isn't going to be rehabilitated is perhaps overstating it, because the ego inflation, we're all susceptible to that. And, you know, that's one of the things about doing it in the context of a community, is the community is going to help keep you in line and keep your feet on the ground, right? And it just kind of goes with what you're saying about being wary of even those healers who have a lot of the light, you know. And I think about this like psychological rule that the bigger the ego, or the bigger the personality, the bigger the mana or power, the bigger the shadow that accompanies it. And we all have the potential, we all carry a shadow. And I think there's a lot of like kind of indigenous wisdom in the personification of these plants as people, because we all understand that we have a light side and a dark side.
Mhm.
And so if we look at the plants as people, well, they would also have a light side and a dark side.
Mhm.
And so
Well,
go forward with respect and but also a sense of wariness and keep your eyes open.
yeah, absolutely. I really agree with everything you just said. And actually, when you're dealing with a plant as powerful as tobacco, I mean, you can tell people until you're blue in the face, ooh, stay away from that plant because if you smoke it, it might give you cancer and it contains molecules that are bad for your health. You know, the usual public health discourse. Um, I'm not saying that that discourse shouldn't exist. But I think that when you get tobacco users to consider that the plant has a powerful personality and that something like the mother of tobacco that Rafael Chanchari talks about, and that the personality behind tobacco is powerful, uh, can mislead you, can lead you into difficult places. Um, that yeah, that she has a powerful personality. Actually, the indigenous Amazonian people could consider that the energy behind tobacco is masculine, even though they talk about the mother of tobacco. The mother of tobacco is masculine in their view. So he, she has a powerful addictive personality, and you got to watch out. And when you personify tobacco like this, it may well be easier for a lot of people, and I'm talking about the 1.2 billion cigarette smokers in the world, because the warnings on the packet don't do that much. The rational discourse that says tut tut, this is bad for you, doesn't really do that much. But if you start thinking, ooh, this is a power plant, and in this plant there is this powerful entity, and she's got a powerful addictive personality, and that I got to watch out, otherwise she's going to kick my butt. Um, it makes it I think something that's more immediately graspable. It's not about agreeing or disagreeing with a rational argument. It's about understanding who you're dealing with,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
not what you're dealing with, but who.
Yeah.
So it makes you more attentive.
Yeah. And then you can be in relationship with it and not just kind of intellectually stand above it as some lower form of nature or something.
Mhm. Because
This was like,
thinking of it just as like nicotine and some other
yeah,
molecules, it actually makes it abstract and distant. And you can think, oh, well, I mean, what isn't a bunch of molecules? That piece of wood over there is too. I mean, so what? But once it's personified, it's, oh, well, it's like an animal that you suddenly, there's a jaguar in your office. You're thinking, whoa.
yeah.
Uh,
Well, one way that this is really brought home to me, I was watching a Canadian documentary years ago about Indigenous North American use of tobacco. And they were interviewing an elder, and she was talking about I think it was her nephew, like was in the room and he started coughing. And she said, "Oh, that's a grandfather telling you you've been smoking too much."
uh,
And it was just kind of so natural to personify tobacco that way. But just it really hit home for me, just that personification, and like the cough is grandfather telling you that you've just been using it irresponsibly, or you've been using him irresponsibly.
can we take just a break for a minute? I want to fill up my glass of water.
Yeah, me too.
Okay, good. Okay.
Good.
Yeah, good.
Well, speaking of personification of these power plants, maybe we could take the opportunity now to dispel this cultural meme that's been passed around the ayahuasca world, that ayahuasca is a female spirit.
Mhm.
You always hear people talk about Mother Ayahuasca and Mama Ayahuasca. And I mean, in two of the traditions that I've encountered ayahuasca in, Santo Daime and the Shipibo, they both consider that ayahuasca, the brew that we drink, is actually a marriage of the male and female principles. The male principle being the vine, the female principle being the leaf, chacruna usually. So it's always kind of bothered me that this meme is perpetuated in the neo-shamanic circles,
Uh-huh.
that ayahuasca is this loving mother. She's stern, but she's loving.
Right. Well, you know, as an agnostic, um, I consider that people are free to believe what they want. So, you know,
I
I
agree.
don't, I don't want to start. Somebody wants to grandmother this or grandfather that, and they can go for it. But it's true. Like ayahuasca is not the same thing as a grapefruit or so somebody wanted to say, oh, grandfather grapefruit, fair enough. You want to call your grapefruit that like that, you can do that. But um, ayahuasca is an important plant for indigenous Amazonian people. It comes from there. It has a tradition. It has a method of use that goes with it. It's not just a sort of a product that you can take and then voila, kind of make it your own. Um, I mean, you can just take ayahuasca out of the Amazon and bring it home and then do whatever you want with it. I mean, you can eat peanut butter with it if you want, but um, still, most people have understood that ayahuasca is something you need to ritualize it. It's too powerful to use without defining a space and time when you use it. In other words, they have taken it as an Amazonian thing, and they use it in a way analogous to how people in the Amazon use it. And so much cannot be said about tobacco, for example. I mean, industrial cigarettes have nothing to do with a shamanic tobacco session. But ayahuasca, so then I think it is something like that. It comes with a kind of a need that it is appropriate to respect the traditions from which it comes. And so that if you're suddenly calling it grandmother, um, well, you're imposing a grid on it
Well,
that actually,
it's a projection.
yeah, and that it isn't really there. And so it means, to a certain extent, a lack of respect for the indigenous traditions of ayahuasca. So how do they gender ayahuasca then? Well, it's actually fairly interesting that in some indigenous traditions, it is associated with a masculine persona, and other traditions with a feminine persona, but then it can also be associated with all kinds of animals. The whole point is that it's a master of transformation. In the places where it's a necessary combination of plants, it makes sense that it should be masculine and feminine. That's the whole point, is that there is no fixed persona. Can be masculine, can be feminine, can show up as a bunch of gringo doctors, can show up as a hummingbird or as a black boa, and then it can change into something else again. And that's the whole point, masculine and feminine, or both, or then an animal.
Human and not merely human. Yeah.
Yes. And so, and then that is the essence of ayahuasca so the mother of ayahuasca, the owner of ayahuasca, has that, according to the indigenous people who have worked with it for a long time. So, yeah,
So wait, when you say the mother of ayahuasca, immediately what I think from the psychological perspective is what we're talking about is what is the archetype at its essence. And
well,
so the mother or the archetype of ayahuasca is shapeshifter, transformer.
but
No?
you're right to actually insist right there, and it's something that I should have said. I think that where one of the problems, where one of the problems comes from, is that when you and Rafael Chanchari talks about this, um, in the indigenous languages, when you try to talk about the entity behind the plant, in their language, the word will often be owner. But it can be mother or it can be father. And in fact, those three words are interchangeable. And as is the word essence also. And so the essence of tobacco is the owner of tobacco. Some may say the mother of tobacco or the father of tobacco. It's all the same thing. But in Spanish, it comes out as either they say owner, dueño, or they say madre, which is mother. And so then the Westerners come and they hear, the mother of ayahuasca. But in Ashaninka, people would just as easily say the father of ayahuasca, and actually more probably say the owner of ayahuasca.
Yeah, that's because people in the North and the West, we all have a mother complex. And so we want that mother, we want that grandmother. So that's the immediate projection, I think.
Well, and so then in the book, at one point, Raphael immediately starts talking about the mother of tobacco, and then says, yes, and he is the tobacco horn man. The mother of tobacco is the tobacco horn worm man. Say, wait, so the mother is a man? And I knew, asking that question, that, yeah, I mean, I knew enough that that was actually a good question to ask, because that's right. They often talk about the mother of the plant, and it turns out the mother is masculine. But that's because they're using the Spanish word, and in their mind, the mother is not necessarily a feminine entity. It's just a way of saying the owner of the plant, the personality behind the plant, the entity inside the plant, the person inside the plant, its mother, its father, and so on and so forth. And actually, in Western languages, we don't really have the word for this. I mean, we have the word owner and we have the word mother, and so, but there is not really that word for the person inside the plant that is behind the plant, and that somehow kind of looks after the species, but also kind of appears in individual plants as well. So then we've translated the Spanish word that the indigenous people use when they try to talk to Spanish people, which is madre. And actually, they have the same dissatisfaction with the word spirit, because, and Rafael discusses this as well, that in their language, the word that gets translated into Spanish as spirit has more to do with person, shadow of the person, image of the person. So it's like, yeah, there's the person, and then the image you have of the person. Even it's the same word. If you're going to talk about the person's shadow, you'll use that word. But at no point are you saying spirit. At no point are you implying something religious, as the word spirit does, or even all that immaterial, because the word spirit in our dictionaries is opposed to matter. And so the indigenous Amazonians know that when they speak Spanish and they try to talk about their concepts, that they have to use the word espiritu, but they can feel that their mestizo interlocutors, or even the anthropologists who are there, when they hear the word espiritu, they're hearing something different.
Yeah, they're hearing invisible essence, this ephemeral thing.
And religious.
Yeah.
And in their view, they're not at all going on to a religious terrain when they talk about the spirit of the plant.
Hmm.
So there's a problem with
Yeah.
Western words or lack of Western concepts when talking about this stuff. And probably the whole grandmother ayahuasca focus is based on a kind of a misreading of the idea of the mother of ayahuasca. But
Well,
that,
I think psychologically it becomes the mother that all of us wanted to have but didn't get, you know.
well, in Mother Earth, right?
Yeah. Yeah, we've got like this yeah, kind of new monotheism arising around Gaia.
I mean, the funny thing is that if you look at all of the biosphere, it's like shot full of masculine and feminine. I mean, when it is gendered, it's both.
Yeah.
The idea that like one is above the other, I mean, biologically makes zero sense. So the father, the son, and so forth was already one-sided trip, and Mother Nature and Grandmother Ayahuasca is another one-sided trip.
Yeah, it's the
But
one-sided compensation for the other, and
that's right. But actually, the real thing is a inescapable blend of both. So
lots
it's
and so much ambiguity, and that's what I appreciate about the story that you're telling that you've got from your friends down in South America is it's full of ambiguity, and it's you can't pin it down to a board like we so want to do with our Western minds.
what's really interesting about that is that so they talk about Western dichotomies as if like we were people obsessed with dichotomizing, but actually people around the world dichotomize. And the idea, there's some explanation that's been given for this, is that you have on the one hand and on the other hand. So we have two hands. And so we tend to on the one hand and on the other hand, and everybody does this. But for example, Ashaninka people, when they talk about the invisible entities inside all living beings, they call them maninkari, which is those who are hidden. They're making a dichotomy between what you see and what you don't see. So they are saying they're saying these entities are usually invisible. With ayahuasca and tobacco, you can see them. So they're usually invisible, but sometimes you can see them. So they're not beyond dichotomizing. But those same entities, maninkari, when they're translated into Spanish, they become spirits. And in the word spirit, there is an absolute opposition between material and immaterial. Well, the first thing is that the Ashaninka are not talking about a difference between material and immaterial. They're talking about a difference between visible and invisible.
Mm-hmm.
And the Amazonian way of making dichotomies is much more permeable. In other words, invisible, but sometimes visible. And actually, these maninkari, they're not that immaterial if we must talk about their materiality or lack of materiality, because the way that people think of them, they are what animate living organisms. And when they leave the living organism, it dies. So they're most of the time intrinsically part and parcel of living organisms. So not that immaterial, unlike what true spirits should be. All this is to say that what makes Western dichotomies specific or particular is that they tend to be absolute. You have good and evil, material and immaterial, body and mind, and so forth. And so the body is everything that mind is not, and the mind is everything that the body is not, or nature and culture. And these are frankly Western concepts, not because they dichotomize, but because they are so absolute and so impermeable. And there's a lot more ambiguity. And all you got to do is think of the yin yang image, where you have the white kind of serpent shape and the black kind of serpent shape, but a little bit of black in the white and a little bit of white in the black. In other words, it's not clear cut.
Well,
There's always a bit of bleeding.
well, that's what I was going to say. Even that image is very defined and clear cut and delineated. I think the more accurate version of the yin yang is if you took a drawing of that on paper and put some water on it so the colors bled together and there was a gray area. That would probably be closer to it. Um, when you're talking about the conception of the hidden one inside, or the hidden one behind the plant or the person. I think it's more akin to what we would think of as soul rather than spirit. And I wonder, is alma, is that a word that they use to talk about this?
Yeah, well, Alma also has its problems. And it also, just like spirit, it has its religious connotations. I mean, it is a Latin word, and it does come out of Judeo-Christian concepts. So um, I'm not sure that soul or alma is what is going to sort of get us through this, um, in terms of going into Amazonian concepts on their own terms
Yeah.
and
I'm struggling
understanding.
with them.
Because actually it's more like, when they talk about the spirit or the soul, that's how it would be said in Spanish or in English, of, let's say, a hummingbird. Um, what they're talking about in their language is the person in that hummingbird. There's somebody home, the somebody in there. Um, so that we can interpret that as, oh, well, the soul, or, I mean, these different words. But really, the word I think that would be closest to the indigenous concept is person.
Hmm. Yeah.
And so that the notion of the Amazonian notion is that, so you see a hummingbird, for example, um, but actually in the hummingbirds world, they are humans like us.
Yeah.
And so when
Well,
they go home, they take off their animal suit, and there's a little human in there, and they're just like us. And they see us as strange predators, just like we might see jaguars. Um, but so that in their world, they are humans, from their point of view. And it's not talking about soul, it's not talking about spirit, it's just saying there's people inside,
yeah.
people inside.
No, I hear you. I love that. That it's the hidden one inside, and the hidden one inside of me and the hummingbird. They look very similar, but it's like we're wearing different costumes out there in the world.
Well, for example, the Ashaninka, what they say is that with ayahuasca and tobacco, you can see these maninkari, these hidden entities, and they are Ashaninka. And because the hidden entities are Ashaninka, it means that the hummingbird is too. It means that the manioc plant is also. So it's like saying the hummingbird is Canadian. The blade of grass is not Canadian, but a Canadian. I am a Canadian. The blade of grass is a Canadian. That maple tree over there is a Canadian. So that we're all one family, despite our different appearances. Ashaninka actually means us folks.
Yeah.
Like in their language, that's what it means, and it's
Isn't that what every tribal name means? It's like it's us, like we're the humans, and everyone else is the other.
yeah, often, but their view is that even though the Shipibo over there are certainly not us folks and they're Shipibos, but still within their world, the plants and the animals in their world, in their view, are Ashaninka as well. In other words, people like us.
Yeah.
They are folks like us. Um, and so that's, I think, and now there are anthropologists who've thought about this and who say that's what animism is. It's recognizing the personhood of plants and animals. If you're in a place where people consider plants and animals as people, you're in downtown animism.
Yeah, well, anima being the Latin word for soul. I think, there's an argument to be made here. I'm hammering on this because I find it really interesting, actually, the ambiguity of it all, and wrestling with South American indigenous concepts. I love doing those wrestling matches. But one way that I'm finding it's resonating with me is what we're talking about is that if we're saying the hummingbird, it's that individual hummingbird, but behind that hummingbird or within that hummingbird is also the mother of hummingbird with a capital H that defines how that hummingbird looks and how it acts and its song and its attraction to sweet things. But there's also that particular hummingbird who I might see every day coming to my flower garden. And so, first of all, I just love that. And it resonates to me as being like the psychological idea of the soul, but then also the archetype, which is the primary essential pattern. So there's my individual expression of human, but there's also human archetype, let's say, that we share.
Yeah, that's not a question though.
No, just a reflection on that.
Yeah, yeah, no, for sure. But
Just trying it on for size.
I would also add that the individual hummingbird is probably also like a representative or a representation of the mother of hummingbirds.
Exactly. Yeah.
Not just that the mother of hummingbirds is animating the individual hummingbird, but more also that the individual hummingbird is an incarnation of, well, the mother of hummingbirds.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that, well, you could say the same thing finally with humans, as you just said, that we, each and every one of us is an example of humanity, an exemplar of humanity, a representative of humanity. You know, it may not feel like it when you get on the bus in the morning, and you may think, who are all these other human beings? And you may feel very different from them, but still, I guess that you could take, there's 8 billion of us at this point. If you took any one and then, you know, put them in a spaceship and said, okay, you are now the representative of humanity. And we'd like to send you to go and talk with these extraterrestrials here. That any one of us, 8 billion, could represent humanity. I mean, more or less well, more or less, you know, to everybody's satisfaction. But still, I think it is true that to a certain extent, every individual is a representative of that individual species.
But, you know, this is fundamental to a lot of the problems that we're seeing these days is that we're so fixated on the visible. And in that, looking at all the differences, we're always seeking out the differences. What distinguishes me from them from me? And if we were able to see the hidden one inside, like have a sense of the hidden one inside of me, then oh, well, Jeremy's got a hidden one inside of him too, and we're both human. You know, we're both Canadian. We're both Ashaninkan. Then the external doesn't matter so much. Like you said, it becomes more permeable and yeah.
I think it's true that how you're educated makes a difference. And, you know, if you're brought up as a young Ashaninka to think that there are people inside the plants and animals around us, you will have a different way of approaching how you live your life than if you're told, look, all those are just grass, you can go out and mow it. That's wood, you can go and chop it. There's a mountain, you can just go and dig into it and extract from it. And it's all just a bunch of matter. And the more you can accumulate for yourself, the better. It'll make you rich. You know, if that's the education you receive, it's true. You're going to look at the plants and animals around you with a different light. And it's probably true that something like ayahuasca can help certain people have empathy with other species and understand that other species are similar to us or even members of our family like us. That finally, actually, what does it mean to be a person? when you say
Mhm.
there's a person inside the plant. Philosophers have debated this. One answer I like is you have a point of view. A person has a point of view. A snowflake doesn't have a point of view, as far as we know. So a snowflake is not a person. Um, but yeah, a blade of grass perceives, learns, remembers, communicates, grows. Um, from its reality has a point of view. There's someone home. It makes decisions. It grows one way and not the other. And that being able to imagine what the point of view of another species might be is already a step in the right direction. And it's quite obvious that ayahuasca and other psychedelics also help people uh, think out of their own box and have empathy with other species and imagine what their point of view might be. And that's already an enormous step, is because as soon as you start considering that the blade of grass is not just something that you got to go out and mow, but that it actually has its own point of view,
Mhm.
then it allows you to have a relation with it. I mean, the whole point of objective materialist knowledge is that it's to deny personhood to the plants and animals, turn them into objects that can be used, and with whom we don't have relations. It's so much easier to to kill, exploit, extract if you just think it is a bunch of matter. It's a lot more difficult if you have a relation with it. But which is not to say that I mean, Amazonian people are hunters. And so they're also gardeners, so they kill plants and animals, but they understand that, and sometimes they get killed themselves. They understand that if you are going to eat members of your family who are Ashaninka just like you, then the least you can do is take their point of view into consideration, treat them with respect, say thank you. I mean, everybody, the jaguars got to eat, the anacondas got to eat, the fish have got to eat, and we have to eat. So we have to kill other species. And if you think like they do, then you have to eat members of your own family. That's the main dilemma of the animist, is
Mhm.
that so that then you have to negotiate that, and it means recognizing the relationship and recognizing that the other has a point of view and trying to take it into consideration. Um,
Yeah.
so it establishes a whole new way of relating, quite literally.
Yeah. Yeah. You reminded me of an anecdote that I read about early European anthropologist who was studying, I believe, the Inuit, and it seemed that their biggest struggle was that they constantly had to eat souls.
That's it.
It was the hardest thing for them to deal with.
That's it. In other words, people.
Yeah, yeah, that was their biggest struggle. Um, I think, yeah, I think this is a really important point that we've come to, and I'm wondering, like, what you think. It feels important to me, but that we don't just take the plants as teachers or agents for healing, but maybe also that we take some of the cosmology of the people who are stewarding the plants, and that maybe is really a lot of the medicine that we as Northerners or Westerners, gringos, that's what we actually need, is to start seeing the hidden person inside all things. Like, we make this leap in depth psychology. It's called like the as if leap. So when you have a dream or you have a vision or a fantasy, you act as if it were real, because our Western mind has been so cultured or conditioned to see things materialistically, and we're the only ones with souls, and that, like you said, allows us to do what we will. Um, so we make this leap as if, and I think the blade of grass. If I act as if it has a soul and is a being worth considering or consulting with, that actually probably makes me a better gardener. So if I dialogue with the blade of grass and I go, well, from the grass's perspective, like, what do you need right now? You look a little dried out. perhaps you need a little water. Perhaps you don't need cutting. Perhaps you need to grow longer. It opens up this whole dialogue that actually just kind of makes sense when you get down to it. If you're willing to make that imaginative leap,
Yeah,
you know.
I agree. I think as if is a very useful device, and especially on this count. But what I'd say is that as Westerners, just going and taking like an Amazonian cosmology and saying, okay, those guys were right, we are wrong. So now I'm going to apply the Amazonian cosmology in my life. Um, I'm not sure that's the way to go about it. In fact, my hunch is that that's not the way to go about it. And that it's kind of close to playing Indian. Um,
Yeah.
but, you know, okay. But
But the essence of the cosmology, the
yeah,
animistic
but
essence
I
of it.
say that what we can do is inspire ourselves by saying, okay, we know there are these approaches that others have had. We're not necessarily going to say that they're so right that we're just going to subscribe to them and forget what we used to subscribe to, but they're an example of an alternative way of looking. So we've been down this path of looking at all of nature as a bunch of objects. But still, we're coming from that Western culture. At this point, I think we got to invent something new. It may inspire itself from the Amazonian vision. And I'm not sure exactly. So how when you come out of like 300 years of materialism, how do you rekindle relationships? You're not an Amazonian indigenous person. You're somebody who's coming out of 300 years. It's like coming out of a hangover. And so how do you, at this point, rekindle a relationship? What are the words you're going to use? Well, I think this is what needs inventing still. I mean,
Yeah.
we're at that point where, and suggestions are welcome. I think just sort of like applying the Amazonian grid has something that is, it's almost like too ready-made. The work that needs doing is not taking a thing and then applying it. It's like figuring out how, from our culture, what we got to do, yes, inspired by those other, because we know other models are possible. We're not going to apply them word for word necessarily, but now we got to figure out how we can recreate the relation that we've been denying. And
Yeah.
I mean, maybe once we've done this for a while, we'll end up in a place that will be very similar to what Amazonian people have come upon themselves, or maybe it'll be quite different. And I say Amazonian because, of course, there's like Native Americans, and in Canada and all around the world there are indigenous people, and it by no means are all of their cosmologies similar. But that said, I think yes, they all consider that there is that the other species are like us and that we can have relations with them. And in fact, Western culture is the exception in this. It's the only culture that has treated all the other species like a bunch of objects and denied relationship. So,
Yeah.
that's what indigenous people have in common around the world, is that they never did make the choice that Western people made to cut themselves off from the kinship with the other species. So
Yeah.
now that we know that actually that kinship is real because molecular biology has proved it. Well, so then we got to get back. We got to get back to figuring out how to relate to our family. And yeah, we can take classes in the Amazon and with Native Americans and with Aboriginal Australians, but I think we also got to do our own homework.
Yeah. No, I'm totally with you. I would never suggest that we take on someone else's cosmology and just try and superimpose it over our Judeo-Christian psyches. That would be a big spiritual bypass and just putting more stuff in the shadow bag that we're dragging around behind us.
Well,
But
see,
what?
it leads to things like grandmother ayahuasca, where
Yeah. Well, and it leads to people wearing, Shipibo garb and whatever, right? Just kind of taking it all on. Which I don't, personally, yes, everyone's free to do whatever they want, what makes them happy, but I personally have some problems with it and I don't often see it working.
I know.
But so what I would say, like toward a, um, a Western animism, let's say, I think like there's a real poverty of imagination in our culture. And imagination is what allows me to personify and then be in relation with and dialogue with the not merely human. So, one of the things that ayahuasca can actually help rekindle is our imaginations, which have been completely desiccated in our image rich culture. So that's one way I think that it can help. But we don't need ayahuasca to rekindle our imaginations. We need good stories and storytelling. We can look at our dreams. We can not dismiss our fantasy life and our daydreaming.
So right. So right. And I think this is one of the things with ayahuasca. And Benny Shannon has written about this in his book, The Antipodes of the Mind, Charting the Phenomenology of the Ayahuasca Experience, where, yes, ayahuasca enhances mental imagery, the capacity to have images, make images, in fact, to imagine. And what he also writes is that the imagination is, it's got bad press. Oh, that's just your imagination. But actually, imagination is this powerful, magical thing whereby you can have images of something that doesn't exist yet, for example. You can imagine the future. You can conjure up images in your mind of new solutions or whatever it might be. And so, yes, ayahuasca is something that clearly enhances people's capacity to see images with their eyes closed. I mean, this has been confirmed by brain imagery. Um, so, yes, anything that enhances people's capacity to come up with new ideas, new solutions, see images. This is something that is precious.
Yeah, I think so needed too. And I think it's the only way to find the answers to the questions that we're currently struggling with in our global culture.
Well,
Like
not the
behind
only way, but perhaps certainly an
no,
important.
I think it's the only way. Behind any invention or innovation is imagination. Somebody had to have a vision.
True, but then there's all that work that should not be neglected, in my opinion, between the vision and the final product, as it were, is bringing the vision into reality is the tough part, and so and actually rationalism can play its place, and if you want to make a vision real, you got to run it by the rational part first. And then if you can get both, if you can get the rational part to tighten the bolts on the vision, then you're in business.
Oh,
Um,
totally.
and
Yeah.
so like in the Cosmic Serpent, that's absolutely what the method was. It was to sort of imagine what the connections might be and then go and do the research and get the rational data to back it up. And that by going back and forth between imagination and rational, then you get a sort of a serious kind of fabric. But
Yeah, I'm totally with you. Yeah.
I got to run, in
Yeah.
fact, because my family's waiting for me for dinner.
Yeah, I can see it darkening behind you. So I think that's a beautiful place to end it. So the book is coming out September 1st. It's published through New World Library, and
Yeah,
it's called Plant Teachers, Ayahuasca, Tobacco, and
the pursuit of knowledge.
the Pursuit of Knowledge. Beautiful. Well, thanks so much for spending time with us. And I love everything you offered. And I love this little book that you can take with you. What's the Latin word again?
The vade mecum.
Wonderful. Thank you,
Brian,
Jeremy.
I really enjoyed talking with you, and it was obvious that you've been doing a lot of thinking on these subjects. At some points, I felt that you were talking better than I was on the subject. So Maybe one day I'll do a podcast and I'll invite you on.
I'd love it. And yeah, we have much more we could talk about. There's a lot more misconceptions that I'd love to dispel with you sometime. So maybe down the road we can meet again.
With pleasure.
Take care.
Thanks a lot, Brian.
Thank you.
Ciao.
Ciao.